Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hello and welcome to the Central South Consortium podcast. Today we'll be discussing the considerations we need to make around wellbeing in the digital world. We all know this is a hugely appropriate time to discuss this very prevalent issue and getting schools and parents to think about keeping wellbeing at the heart of all of our pupils. I would like to start by making some introductions. My name is John Welch and I'm the lead for equity and wellbeing at Central South Consortium. Over to Kath.
Hello, my name's Catherine Billington-Richards and I'm the Strategic Lead for LLC at Central South Consortium.
My name is Matthew Humphreys. I'm the Strategic Lead for Digital Education at Central South.
My name is Graham James. I'm Lead Practitioner for Digital Education.
So today in this podcast, we'll be talking about how our pupils can be too long on devices and is it really going to do them any harm? We're going to kick things off with handing over to Matthew, who with Graham has spent some time researching this area from a digital perspective. So Matthew, what is the research telling us about devices and its impact on wellbeing?
Well, when we're considering wellbeing in a digital world, it's easy to focus on what you're doing, the use of a device or the screen time, the formats or platforms you're using. We consider live teaching versus pre-recorded content, interactive engagement versus independent responses. So we spend a lot of time thinking about what we're actually doing with the device, how long we're on it, how we're using it. What we also need to be mindful of is what we're not doing. UNICEF and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health have both conducted research into the impact of screen time. They drew out the displacement impact high levels of screen time can create. Displacement accounts for the things you're not doing because of the use of the device for an extended period. So at the moment where we have pupils engaging with technology and devices for long periods of time, the things that this can displace include physical exercise, socializing, taking regular breaks, developing fine motor skills, or even it can affect your sleep. So these things need to be considered when we look at the effect of screen time on your well-being.
Thank you, Matthew. So, as a parent myself and in charge of wellbeing, it's really difficult to find the balance. As we know, during lockdown, quite often times we'll be out of the house and away from devices. What support could we give parents and carers and schools in finding the balance with devices, Graham? And we know this is a super challenge because quite often that break away from devices for pupils is to go on to a game or to play. So what advice could you give us there?
That's an excellent question, John, and there really is lots of interesting sort of research to help parents. For example, you could consider looking at Lisa Guernsey's rubric, which thankfully is actually really, really easy to remember. 3 words: content, context, and child. So content, essentially it's about the quality of the screen time, and that's arguably more important than the quantity of the screen time. Research from the University of Calgary supports this. I mean, are children accessing appropriate content for their age? Is it quality educational content, or are they playing and accessing material that's just not appropriate? Are parents and children aware of PEGI ratings? As a parent, I would strongly advise that you have conversations with your children about what they're actually looking at, have that meaningful digital conversation. And obviously within Wales, we have the digital competency framework, which teaches our children how to stay safe online and to be aware of the content they're looking at. The second part of Lisa Guernsey's rubric is context. Where and what is going on when the children are on the devices? Are they locked away alone in their bedroom? Or are they sat next to a parent who's talking to them about what they're accessing? Essentially, is there human interaction going on? Have they been glued to their screen for 5 hours straight? Or are they having regular breaks over a period of time? And that's particularly important at the moment when we've got remote learning going on and children are accessing content, predominantly online. Are they having those regular breaks? And there's numerous studies that also back up, going back to what Matthew said with displacement, about 2 hours a day, ironically, is about the right amount of time to be on a device, which obviously proves difficult when they are accessing remote learning at the moment. And that leads us on to the third part, which is the child. really knowing each individual child. Has their mood changed? Are they spending more and more time on their devices? Are they able to regulate the use of their devices themselves, or is it difficult to get them off a device? And remembering that important to socialize with them. I think that human interaction, that being on the devices with their parents, is incredibly important. So to conclude, essentially think content, context, and child. I mean, in 2017, UNICEF also made a similar conclusion. Theirs was content, contact, and conduct. The contact, as I said, is really important, as it means that parents and adults are actively involved with their child's digital life.
Matthew?
Yeah, it's really interesting listening to Graham there, because I'm just thinking about some of the practices that have been developing in schools across the region over the last few months. And what's been really nice to see is schools considering this particular aspect of digital well-being and making sure the structures and the content they put in place for their pupils provides opportunities to be away from the screen. So for instance, where you have an activity that might be physical or based on the environment and being out and about, those sorts of activities and approaches to distance learning illustrate that you don't have to be tied to the device the whole time. The device is the way of delivering that content, but as to how that's enacted or developed, that can be taken in so many different ways. And we've seen that really clearly in many schools across the region. I think, secondly, some of the professional learning that's been run in recent months by Central South and with some guest speakers, we've seen some really innovative and interesting techniques for using the digital technology. So, for instance, where you might have some form of lesson where you're considering a text, providing opportunities for pupils to pause the session, walk away from the session, and read. Being able to develop those skills that they wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to if it was solely a digitally based curriculum. And I think that's something that we need to consider further as well. How can we use the technology to deliver the learning opportunities, but those learning opportunities to be extended and developed away from the screen?
I think that's some really interesting points there, Matthew, Graham. Thank you. I think it leads us nicely into handing over to Kath then, from a language literacy and communication perspective. What's your opinion on the devices and well-being argument that seems to be throwing around a lot at the moment?
I think I'll start by saying I'm going to say something that would probably my husband and children would be really shocked at, because we have quite strict rules about screen time and things like that in our house. But I think we're not living in a normal world at the moment, and we need to recognise that the use of devices and online technology is massively supporting children's well-being. As a parent, I reflect that my child has been able to have daily contact with his friends because of devices and because of the digital world, and that's been a huge lifeline. It's kept friendships going. It's also been massively important for his oracy. He's having conversations every day. They're interacting. They're collaborating. So, I'm going to start with that as a huge benefit. If we'd experienced this 10 years ago, I think the experience for our children would have been really different. Graham, I can see you want to come in there.
Yeah, and just to sort of back up what you're saying, that technology does give that human interaction, because more and more schools are doing these live sort of check-in sessions to really support the well-being of the children.
Definitely. And from a parent's point of view as well, I found things like YouTube really helpful, actually, that I sat with my child and we curated a YouTube playlist that he was then going to use independently to spin off into a piece of work. So that access to that has been hugely beneficial. I think what we do need to be mindful of is it's undeniable that devices can cause poor concentration, and they can lead to a decrease in standards of work. So it's being mindful of things like pop-ups and links, and how easy is it to switch off something onto Twitter, or no teenager would use Twitter, but Instagram. So we need to be careful about that in online working. Now, I know on Hub, for example, when you create a playlist, if you import a YouTube video, it takes away all those pop-ups or watch next, doesn't it? So it's finding ways around that we can sort of minimize the distractions that online working can bring about. I don't know if Matthew or Graham have other tips and ideas. The Hub playlist is my only one, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think that, when you're considering YouTube, for instance, a lot of these platforms run with infinite content. So when you get to the end of the video, the next one comes up, then the next one, and that links in really clearly with some reports that have looked at the impact of some of these platforms on sleep. Because often, if you're using a device late at night and you're looking at something on YouTube and it leads to the next video, you can really eat up time quite quickly, and then that's the effect of displacement there in that example. John.
Yeah, just thinking about some of the research around sleep, the recommendation is that, it's 2 hours before the sleep begins that they're away from a device. Around the blue light stuff is going to contribute around that. And that's something particularly as a parent that I really struggle with, because particularly my eldest son, if he's been working all day, remotely, and then he wants to play on his device or computer or whatever and interact with his friends, quite a lot of that's at 7-8 o'clock at night now because he's 12. That's pretty close to sleep time, and that's where you find the conundrum of the well-being interaction that we know is vital for our kids and our pupils and the schools that we support, but at the same time thinking about that balance between sleep and well-being and routines. Matthew?
I think that it's really interesting in some of the approaches that we're seeing in schools and some really positive developments. And I think from my perspective, a school that I'm really familiar with, they've had a massive focus on reading, especially with the younger learners over the last few weeks, and that's been really, really beneficial for the learners. They've been able to really practice those skills quite intensively, and therefore avoid some of those missed opportunities that might have manifested themselves at other points. But I just wanted to ask Kath really if she had any tips for how we can ensure that we're still developing literacy in particular, because I think that's a particular area of risk at the current time.
Yeah, definitely. I think, Matthew, to be honest, it's all about the sort of work that we're setting and the pedagogy behind it. So I've seen some fantastic ideas, schools in our region using Flipgrid, for example, to develop oracy skills, particularly around presentation. I think the next logical step with this is looking at, for example, how you could use a tool like Flipgrid to collaborate, because when you think of the literacy and numeracy framework, one of the key elements is collaboration and discussion. So, that can be done asynchronously. For example, if I was a teacher, I might post a controversial viewpoint, or I might say, I think in schools we shouldn't have school uniform. And children then can use the sort of Voice 21 discussion roles and join in that discussion, but in an asynchronous format, sort of either building on what the teacher has said, challenging what the teacher has said, or discussing what the teacher has said. So I think it's about, we've got a baseline. How do we move forward? How do we look at progressing that? Matthew, I can see you want to jump in on that point.
Yeah, I think that really illustrates well, one aspect of the digital competence framework, which has perhaps been underdeveloped over the last few years, and that is collaboration. And you've illustrated really well there how that applies in a cross-curricular context, and that's really interesting. What I'm particularly interested in is how we develop those written skills, especially in a context where now, rather than being in a very specific environment with teachers and supporting teaching assistants overseeing those developments, how do we ensure that written skills are still strengthened and developed over what is quite a lengthy period away from the classroom?
I think, to be honest, our evidence is it's quite a depressing picture, actually. Our evidence from national comparative judgment work is telling us that writing is suffering hugely, particularly around sentence structures. My feeling, though, that the answer is not then in setting lots of extended independent writing. The focus for me would be on building mastery at sentence level writing to ensure success there. I think when you've got sort of foundational skills mastered, then you can catch up, can't you, quite rapidly. But without that sort of foundational skill sort of mastered, it's very, very challenging to do that. I think what we need to recognise is writing is arguably one of the most cognitively challenging tasks that we can get children to do. They've got to create the content. They've got to be able to write in acceptable sentences. They've got to punctuate correctly. They've got to have interesting vocabulary. They've got to organise the structure. They've got to display information. I could go on, okay? So spending time during blended learning, perhaps on honing and crafting writing at a sentence level for me is really, really crucial, because that's what we're seeing is slipping. Children are stopping writing in those complex sentences and reverting back to simple, basic sentences. So instead of sort of setting lots and lots of extended writing that children might struggle to do independently, working at that sentence and paragraph level, I think is really important. Of course, there will be children who have mastered those foundational skills. They can still benefit from sort of honing their style and honing their sophistication. And they might be able to attempt some more extended pieces. But I think we need to think about, what do we want the children to be able to achieve? Matthew and John, I can see that you both want to come in here. So John, do you want to come in?
I think Matthew, go on after you.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, it links really, really clearly with that point, really, Kath. And I think it's really interesting, because what we're seeing is schools saying, well, we're either live streaming or we're doing pre-recorded content, and they have one particular approach. But whatever your approach is as a school, what you've just demonstrated there, Kath, can be developed in any of those ways. So, for instance, if you're narrating some learning material, you can narrate the actual process and demonstrate how that sentence mastery can be gained, and then provide a short burst material. Or similarly with pre-recorded content, you can give a pause now and do. So pause the video here. Now I want you to go and do this, and allow it that way. And similarly in a live situation. So those different approaches can all be utilised to develop the literacy skills in the way that you've mentioned.
Yeah, definitely. All I was going to say is that it's a nice opportunity for activities away from a screen as well, isn't it? That's what we were talking about. You can do that away from a screen on old-fashioned pen and paper, if it will still be in use after all of this. John?
I think the key to this will be really careful planning. When my take around vulnerable learners, the work around disadvantaged and how we're going to think about those, some of the alarming figures that are coming out. I think it's really important that we take into account all of these aspects and the combination, and think about how we're going to address these barriers, not only remotely the way that we are at the moment in lockdown, but certainly when schools go back. Kath, we talk a lot about intervention and, how we're going to overcome these barriers. And I guess that would be a real concern and a real area that we would want to support schools in moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, if we can spend this time focusing on those foundational skills, getting that mastery in place, the ability to catch up is more rapid, isn't it? I think as well, we've got to look at reading. We're very acutely aware that not all pupils have sort of equitable access to books at home. So, we're seeing some really lovely innovation across the region. There's a group of secondary colleagues, for example, who've collaborated to read Percy Jackson, The Lightning Thief aloud, and that's being streamed to their children. They've had permission from the author. So we're seeing some really lovely innovation, so that they're still trying to get high quality texts out to their pupils. I'm also aware, that there are primary teachers doing that on a daily basis as well. John, I can see you want to come in.
Yeah, so I guess all of these things at the moment in the world that we live in, are very much remote solutions, aren't they? We've talked around getting some time away and writing and reading and things like that. But from a well-being point of view, the continued concern around mental health, the increase in obesity, the worries around sleep, and particularly students getting into these routines of completely opposite to what a school routine would look like, getting up at 8 and getting on and working through that school day and then getting a good night's sleep. You're hearing alarming stories around children playing through the night, socializing till the early hours. So how are we going to support schools, support parents in finding, we talked around the balance and stuff, but are there any practical tips that we can give our parents to support, or our teachers to support these pupils? Kath?
I mean, I think it's unlikely, isn't it, that we're going to get children to have time away from screens outside of school hours, because it is their only way of communicating with their peers. So I think, as educationalists, as classroom practitioners, it's about really carefully planning and curating the balance of activities over a week that we're setting for children, because, as I said, it is the only way a lot of children have of communicating with their peers. Graham?
Yeah, just to reinforce it, it's the quality of that provision, isn't it, that we're providing for them, and particularly as as a teacher, is making sure that we have those elements of excellent teaching and learning in the content that's being delivered digitally, and to reinforce what Matthew says as well, where possible, to make sure that that's unplugged. And as you said, Kath, get using that good old pen and paper where possible.
Yeah, and I think from an exercise point of view, we need to be encouraging our children, pupils, to get out there and exercise as much as possible. We know that that's being done remotely quite a lot now, via a screen. Lots of staff are delivering those things. The impact of Joe Wicks and things like that. There are accessible things. The World Health Organization would encourage at least 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, and 75 minutes of vigorous activity. So I think that's really important, and I think quite a lot of that will fall on that relationship between home and finding that time, potentially doing that as a family, finding innovative ways to relax. I've also was reading about the impact that it's had on walking, and so many more families are walking as a result of COVID and the lockdown situation, that there's been something like a 50% increase in the amount of walking. So hopefully there will be the legacy of really good family activities that have started. But Matthew?
Yeah, I think one thing we've not mentioned really is the makeup of the current situation out there as well, with so many families having different circumstances, and the pressure of working from home on top of supporting pupils. The fact is that there's an awful lot of pressure on everybody involved, and what's been really nice to see is the amount of focus and effort and innovation going on through what schools have provided around wellbeing. And making sure that they're providing those opportunities to check in with pupils, making sure that they're in regular communication with those families in their community. So there's lots to consider, and it's a very, very complicated picture. But I think that those aspects have been quite encouraging.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Matthew. And I think from my point of view, it's been really amazing how the interaction amongst their peers, or even with staff at school, has benefited so much the pupils. And I think that's been an absolute key driver. And I think quite a lot of the time we're like, come away from a device because it's, worries around that. But actually, if that's a means of increasing socialization and interaction with others, I think that's a real key point. And as we've alluded to all the way through, it's about the balance. It's about finding what's right for you and your family, and that will be an important thing. Just fantastic conversations this afternoon. Thank you very much, guys. It's been a really important topic to discuss and put out there, and I know it's something that we're all concerned about moving forward. As part of the podcast, we will circulate some research that we would encourage schools to use and disseminate to parents, and there'll be some helpful tips and support in there. And this podcast is a series, and please keep an eye out for our next episode at CSC. And thank you all for being a part of today.
Diolch am wrando ar y bennod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tanysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.